General summary. The days of the Son of Man, Luke 17:22, prefaced the last chapter in the history of Israel and the first chapter in the history of the Church. We consider them in the first aspect this term, in the second next term. Christ came 4,000 years after the creation, nearly 1,500 years after the Exodus, 1,000 years after the first temple was built, and 500 years after the second temple, in an age when the fair promise of the restoration had been blighted. Through the Roman conquerors of Palestine, detested Edom had given Israel a king in Herod, the low-born usurper, tyrant over an unwilling people, and more than suspected apostate. See page 228. When Archelaus was deposed, the Jews sought the direct rule of a Roman procurator, thinking they would be freer to manage their own affairs thus. And so the scepter finally departed, even in name, from Judah. For what Josephus calls Agrippa's illegal assumption of the procurator's power from AD 41 to 44 cannot be reckoned as a restoration of the monarchy. Agrippa II, the last descendant of the Asmoneans, sided with the Romans when war broke out in AD 66. The Roman had always shown an aptitude for assimilating conquered nations to himself. The Jew alone doggedly refused to be in friendly relation to him. Each utterly misunderstood, hated, and despised the other, and though Caesar tolerated Judaism as he tolerated the religions of all his subjects, many insults and outrages were offered to it by his officials and soldiers. As for the Jews, though the old demon of idolatry had finally been cast out, see Luke 11:24-26, their creed had shrunk into a dead formula, their religion into a network of elaborate rules which nourished self-righteousness and fanaticism, but left out the weightier matters of the law, Matthew 28:23. Murder in the name of orthodoxy they could justify. What they could not tolerate was teaching of truths new and old that opposed itself to their interests. And while the formalist is always harder to influence than the worldling who makes no religious profession, his pedantic scrupulosity is too often compatible with indifference or actual unbelief. Let us then take heed, lest even in the midst of our religious observances, the law of Christ lose its hold upon our hearts, lest we deceive ourselves and substitute a routine use of the means of grace for a life hour by hour under the power of grace. Again and again the Jews rose in small fruitless seditions, and as Tacitus admits, their patience could endure no longer when Gessius Florus proved even more insolent and rapacious than his predecessors. Suddenly they made themselves masters of Jerusalem, and in November 66 inflicted a crushing defeat upon the Romans at Beth Horon. Vespasian and Titus, both afterwards emperors, were sent to subdue the revolted province. The country was conquered, and in 70 Jerusalem was besieged. Her children were within her. Luke 19:43-44. For the blockade began at the Passover. Just 40 years, always a significant period in sacred history, after the Lamb of God had been slain, and the city was crowded to suffocation. It seemed as if the nation had given itself a rendezvous of extermination, and history tells no tale of such unspeakable horror and overwhelming misery as that of the awful fulfillment of their words to Pilate in Matthew 23:35 and 27:25. Within, the distracted people devoured each other until all were devoured by the irresistible foe without. Josephus, who was no Christian, says in his famous history that it was certainly God who had brought the Romans to punish his people, and that he had doomed this city to destruction as a polluted city, and was resolved to purge his sanctuary by fire. Even Titus felt himself to be the instrument of a calamity far crueler than he wished or intended, and said, as he looked at the city's defenses, "God has been my helper. God it was that pulled down the Jews from these formidable walls, for what could the hands of men or their engines have availed against them?" With the obstinacy of despair, they contested every inch. The temple streamed with the blood of its priests. Its altar slopes were piled with corpses, and on the same day of the year that Nebuchadnezzar had burned it, the house of God was fired and sank in ashes. Matthew 28:38 and 24, verse 2. Without the city gates, Hebrews 13:12, Jews were crucified in such multitudes that room was wanting for the crosses and crosses for the carcasses. They were sold for slaves in such multitudes that at last none would buy them. For the second time, Jerusalem was razed to the ground and disappears from history for 60 years. In AD 132, the crushed people made a final revolt under Bar Kocheba, who claimed to be the Messiah. When this had been suppressed, their God-given land was legally appropriated by the Romans, and the plow passed over desolate and desecrated Moriah. A new city called Aelia Capitolina was reared on Zion and peopled by a Roman colony. None but pagans or Christians were suffered to enter it, but the capitation tax the Jews had formerly paid for the temple worship in Matthew 18:24 was still exacted from them and used to erect a temple to Jupiter Capitolinus on Mount Moriah. John 19:15. For 200 years, the name of Jerusalem was never heard, and Judaism henceforth was a religion deprived of its two most characteristic features, a temple and sacrifices. Thus fell and forever, says Dean Millman, the metropolis of the Jewish state. It might almost seem to be a place under a peculiar curse. It has probably seen a far greater portion of human misery than any other spot upon the earth. In BC 588, it had already been taken 10 times and unsuccessfully besieged twice, and we read of 12 other captures or sieges between 588 and the Christian era. It had had many privileges and sinned many sins, all summed up in 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 15 and 16. Its highest privilege was to receive the words of God from his own Son. Its greatest sin was the deliberate rejection of both message and messenger. Then it suffered the heaviest punishment history records in Luke 13:34 through 35. Comparison of Matthew 10:23, 16:28, 24:34, and John 21:22 shows that its fall was a coming, though not the final coming, of Christ. He had 5 times predicted it and foretold many of its most striking features. The great prophecy of Matthew 24 blends, so that we cannot completely discriminate them until all has been fulfilled, the 3 catastrophes which close the 3 dispensations of the world's history, both the former being types of the last, namely the flood in the past at the end of the patriarchal dispensation, the fall of Jerusalem in the near future at the end of the Jewish dispensation, and the final judgment of the Son of Man in the distant future at the end of the Christian dispensation. Dean Stanley notes only 3 other events of equal magnitude with the fall of Jerusalem: the fall of Babylon, which ended primeval history, the fall of Rome, which ended classical history, and the fall of Constantinople, which ended medieval history. But the fall of Jerusalem has the peculiar interest of involving the dissolution of a religious dispensation with the agony of an expiring nation. Or, looking only at Hebrew history, we may observe 3 desolations of God's house: by the Philistines in BC 1116, by the Chaldeans in BC 588, and by the Romans in AD 70. And 2 crowning catastrophes for Israel, namely that of BC 588, which through Jeremiah's preaching became a new birth to the chosen people, and that of AD 70, which through Christ's preaching led to the development of the church. On both occasions, the city might have been saved had it listened to the preacher. Again, we observe that the chosen people were 3 times expatriated: to Egypt, BC 1706 to 1491, to Babylon, BC 606 to 536, and to all lands from AD 70 onwards. In each case, the expatriation and the return was foretold, and its period fixed, clearly in the second, and vaguely in other cases. Genesis 15:13, Jeremiah 25:12, Daniel 8:14, Luke 21:24. As they have twice literally returned, historical analogy points to a third literal return. See also Isaiah 11:11 and 12, Amos 9:15, passages not applicable to BC 536. 50 years ago, there were scarcely 8,000 Jews in Palestine. Now, 1892, 42,000 of the 58,000 inhabitants of Jerusalem are Jews, and there are at least 100,000 Jews in Palestine, whose number steadily increases. Other conquered and captive peoples have vanished utterly. This inexhaustible race has survived all the determined efforts of Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Titus, and others to abolish it, and the Prussian king, who asked for the briefest and most convincing statement of the evidences of Christianity, had it in the one word, Israel. Israel's downfall began in BC 740 and was consummated in AD 70. Since then, it has ceased to be the medium of God's dealings with mankind. And although represented in nearly all the states and kingdoms of the world, it has never been recognized as one of them. The legend of the Jew Ahasuerus, who spurned Christ on his way to Calvary and was doomed to roam the earth till he came again in glory, simply sums up the nation and the individual. Deuteronomy 28:25. In Millman's History of the Jews, may be read the story of its wrongs and oppressions for the last 1800 centuries, wrongs such as no other race could have survived. Even as I write, Western Christendom, having at last learned that there are better ways of serving Christ than by continuing to bring his blood, Acts 5:28, upon every generation of his own guilty nation, is protesting against new outrages upon the Jews of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, we hear of this new and growing desire among them to return to their own land. And in Bessarabia, there is the dim dawn of a national recognition of him whom they once rejected. Zechariah 12:10. God has called Israel an everlasting nation. Jeremiah 31:35 through 37. Isaiah 44, verse 21. Chapter 54, verse 10. And chapter 66, verse 22. And promised it a hopeful future, Jeremiah 29:11 and 39 verse 17. Our duty to it as Christians is plain. Psalm 122 verse 6, Isaiah 62 verse 7, Romans 11:25 through 32.